And those things, the first thing that he noticed about them is that they were blinding. So he was double checking himself, thinking there's a craft that's too close to him, etc. But as it turned out, he saw them eventually directly in front of him. They were flying past him, and he was looking out in the distance, and there they were. Now, when he got back, he started to talk to different people about this and say, did you see, have you heard anything about this? And other people had said, hey, look, other people have reported this on the ground. It wasn't just Arnold. For a number of people who saw this, and instantly there was a large media contingent that caught on to this. I don't really know, except for the fact that people were very kind of nervous because it was just after World War II. But it does seem like it coalesced quite quickly with his announcement, and the story spread really rapidly. And there are some other interesting factors going on, which is that the next day there was going to be a major air show close by. Here's another odd factor. There was a transport plane that had gone down in that area, and they were offering a $5,000 reward if you could go into those mountains and find it. So there were already odd things happening on the aerospace side before Arnold had his sighting. But when he does touch down, he will later have more experiences by way of seeing craft. That wasn't his only experience. But suddenly, different people get interested in him. And one of the people is named Ray Palmer, and Palmer has a magazine, and he says, I've heard of this other case, and it's over on Maury Island. In Maury Island, it looks like these two guys were on a boat. They saw a craft that sounded kind of like your craft, and something was coming off of it and burned their boat. You might want to check it out. I'll cover your expenses. And they sent him there almost as like a private detective with aviation experience. So he goes there, and he had no idea what he was getting into with it, because the story was big enough, but weird things started to happen. For example, on his way to Maury Island, when he gets into town, and the town is packed, and he can't find a hotel room, and he calls these different hotels, and then one of the hotels he calls says, yes, Mr. Arnold, your room is ready. And he says, what do you mean my room is ready? I haven't ordered it yet. He says, oh yeah, it's all here, Kenneth Arnold coming today. He's like, all right, okay. And then later, during the run of the case, when he's interviewing witnesses, and the witnesses are most unique, then he's getting these strange calls, and they're saying, I can tell you everything that you just did. I can tell you that, you have a towel around your neck, you're reading a newspaper, you just got off the phone with so-and-so, and the surveillance was so tight that he was like, they must have like a dictaphone in here. That's the way that he thought at the time. But it's such total audio-video surveillance on him that he starts to sense there's something up with this case that I'm investigating, and also he's starting to wonder about his own sighting. And originally he was like, this must be experimental aircraft racing. He wasn't even suggesting aliens. But now that he's getting into it, and people are kind of respecting him as an authority on this, things are changing for him. He's under very deep surveillance. And I think it affected him deeply. His life went kind of very strangely after this. He's a very earnest guy. He's from Boise, Idaho. He had a family, and he had a kind of a reputation for honesty. But he set off, with his sighting, this massive wave of interest. And what happens is that there are so many cases around that period. So his case happens June 23rd, and then July 3rd into July 4th is the Roswell incident, which gets reported on the 7th. So we're right in that window, and then there's a major case in Arizona and another one in New Mexico, so there's a whole wave there. And some people have surmised that those are all part of the same wave of UFOs. There's all kinds of ideas about that wave 47. One of them is that there were a number of Crowley-ish things going on in the desert, and that they open some kind of a portal and let the UFOs in. Another is that the atomic explosions going on between 45 and 47 open some kind of parallel dimension. And another is that in setting off these nuclear explosions, aliens were very curious what we were doing setting off nuclear fission. So, there's also the obvious, which is just there's a wave of UFO sightings, like a time had come in humanity's life to see these things and acknowledge them. And that's kind of the way that it worked out. But our reaction to them was quite interesting because at first, although the Roswell case covered up, etc., there was kind of an openness to the idea. And I think humanity was certainly ready on many levels to deal with the alien factor. In that what happens is the X-Protect group coalesces very quickly inside the Central Intelligence Agency corridor with the aerospace companies. And they create this loop of secrecy. They want to study it. They want their, the advantages of studying it. They already have a history on it. So they're starting off ahead of the rest of us by a long shot. And I never bought the idea that, they're all so surprised and they have to cover it up because it was just after World War II and they don't want to scare world-weary populations and things like that. Actually, I don't think that that's true. I think that the secrecy is embedded in that system, and that's why they called in Vannevar Bush. And Vannevar Bush controlled the UFO file, but his training in secrecy had come from being the head of the Masonic Lodge at MIT. And that kind of secrecy that the Masons have worked very well for compartmentalization of the UFO file. That's how they were able to keep that secrecy. And of course, the Manhattan Project and the immense secrecy around that. So we start to learn instantly that secrecy is a way of life for those people, as it is with governments generally. But around the UFO file, it became an obsession. And, for many, many decades, we saw that researchers would come up, they'd have good theories, they would be solid people, astronomers, scientists, and all the rest of it, like Morris Jessup, and then they'd be taken out very quickly. So when we think about that, we have to remember the stakes that are involved for them, which is if they lose control of the UFO file, what happens? And very often people say, well, this is really related to the fact that they weren't ready to tell us about aliens. That's partially true, but I believe there's something else that we've identified in this program. And that has to do with the X technology that resides in the UFO file. And the X technology is not just about flying saucers or alien life or UFOs. It goes beyond that, but they also are part of that. So the X technology is something, even there are echoes of it in our remote past with Atlantis and things of this nature. But then the big updates when we get to Nikola Tesla and Keeley and this type of research, they also touch upon it. So we're already getting into the X technology. And so the X technology that is developed or understood has a quality to it, as does the UFO generation, which is, I put a name on the quality, which is apothium, A-P-O-T-H-E-U-M. That might not be a regular word, but it will do for our purposes. Apothium is a reality distortion field. And over again, when they ran into this, they realized that it had the ability to upset all the physics that they understood. So in a way, I think the way Joseph Farrell describes this is, it made the atomic bomb with a firecracker. So it's such an amazing changeover that they decide complete secrecy, and anything for that secrecy is adequate. So they decide not to share anything with the public, and as decades go by, the public is more and more out of the loop, and it seems like there are forces inside that establishment that are just leaking out ideas about it to see how the public will react. But it's not an adult conversation. It's kind of like feeding little things out to a child, and what happens generally in science is, you get somewhere, you get to a certain level of understanding, like they're doing with age extension now. And then somebody else, another doctor, chimes in on your research, and you keep going up this ladder. But if that whole process is going, you get a splitting off going on. And so now we have this tiny group running this sort of transhumanist automation push, and the whole UFO file thing is wrapped up in that. And the regular society is going off sideways, being like, pushed around basically and given mandates, told they can't show up to work and all the rest. So this is a very imbalanced, problematic situation. But for me, the heart of so much of it goes back to this imbalance of understanding and information about the UFO file. We're going to try to crack more of that as we go tonight. Arnold is a very good place to go. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep tonight here, X Series 114. These are deep state UFO wars. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. And of course, Miss Olivia is putting those together right now. How's it going out there?
Going great. David Termina says, DJ, Leslie Kane's great-great-grandfather, William Lloyd Garrison, whom she draws inspiration from, is also the grandfather of Oswald Garrison Villard, whose son was a major player for the UFO file.
That's really interesting. And the name is extraordinary.
It is extraordinary.
You know that the Fish family is deep in there as well, I'm sure. But those are great. Think about that.
Melanie K wanted to know, have you seen the new Canadian UFO coin? I haven't. I hadn't heard of it.
I have seen it. And there are little kind of head fakes that they're doing on these types of things generally. And it seems like every once in a while there's a big push, like NASA going to Mars and all this stuff. And then it's all down to nothing. They're like, we're going back to the moon in 2024. The first woman is going to be on the moon. And then, a few months later, they're like, actually, we're not going back to the moon. Hence, was quite accurate. It'll be more like 2028. On these weird marketing campaigns, and they're like, William Shatner went into space with Jeff Bezos, whatever. And it's true, but it's barely into space. It's just kind of up there in the atmosphere. So there's a lot of ploys going on along this line, and I think that it plays into what we're talking about tonight, because they're all using this X technology, and I think that holds a great deal for us. All right, let's do a quick thing here on Avril Haines. I try to bring up Avril Haines every time I talk about the UFO file now. She's somebody who's been given a ball. She is the DNI, and as the Director of National Intelligence, is technically at the top of our intelligence community. However, the CIA Director still runs the show, in fact. But now she wants to talk about UFOs, right? This is her thing, like, there might be aliens out there. So this is the approach that they want to take. She is part of the ASRO push. All of that push came through, Avi Loeb, the Galileo Project. We're going to check out scientists going into space, and Oumuamua was an alien probe and all that. And Avi Loeb's office is, 5 or 6 minutes from here, and he put together this group, and then suddenly that group got all militarized, and they had Elizondo, counterintelligence in there, and they had Mellon, defense intelligence in there. So it's all military and defense intelligence people now, completely tanking the credibility. And then if you go back and look at his past, Loeb, who's the big Harvard scientist, who's the first one who's allowed on the record to talk about the UFO thing. I mean, Mac did it, but he wasn't allowed. They tried to take his tenure away. In fact, he didn't have the right timing. He wasn't.
That's how you know he was authentic.
Right. He wasn't knighted by the Queen's
He didn't
Jubilee.
have his own documentary. He wasn't on the cover of GQ.
No, in fact, when they put him on Time magazine, it was like, how can they let this man teach? Or it was like one of those takedowns. And they're so good at that now. Anytime you get a doctor who says anything but the company line,
Canceled.
Like Malone or anybody else. This guy invented the technology, But I can tell you this, which is when we look at the space of the UFO file and where it's at right now, they're trying to get Avril Haines to lead this Avi Loeb thing and then keep the military stuff pushed back in the side there so that they can use it, but that nobody knows that they're really gearing up for it to create just massive amounts of money for military purposes and control, and ultimately for a false UFO threat, which a lot of people are throwing in for at that level. Instead, in the first push for the UFO threat, I think they stumbled around talking about this, and programs like ours and others really called out the UFO threat aspect and said, that's a ploy. And so now they're trying to say, we need to study. And, even when they send Elizondo out now, it's like, I want to study consciousness. After interrogating people in Iraq, doing counterintelligence on people, I want to study consciousness. I'm St. Lou, I want to show you the better way, and the CIA will embrace you. I mean, the CIA, it's an interesting thing, but the function, even in their weird upside-down criminal world, their function has nothing to do with, like, human origins or anything like that. So the fact that they push that, or that they plant people in the Casey Foundation trying to find out about the Hall of Records, it's a little creepy, let's face it.
Understatement.
I mean, you want those people want to be like, let's find Noah's Ark so we can pretend that, like, we're kings. And we were descended from Noah's Ark, or that there was Noah's Ark on Mars. That it was, the World Economic Foundation. That whole thing, the whole idea of these people thinking of themselves on these higher levels is really quite laughable. And the CIA in particular, the function that they serve is that they have to be very good liars because of the spy work that they do. So the last thing you would expect from them is the truth. So when you get like World Economic Forum people like Schwab and things like that, you can just picture in his head, he'll be like, and then we will find these wonderful ruins on Mars and say that our families came from them and therefore have the right to lead the human race. I mean, I can picture it very easily that that's where they're going. And of course, Gigi Young is big on that one too. So, and you should hear her impersonation. But the way I look at it is, it's so obvious they need a narrative for leadership because they're, in a sense, so many of the masks have fallen with them. So many people see beyond the media. But there's enough power that they have over the social media companies, over the technology, over the news media, that they keep enough people entranced, and that's really the nature of the problem. So I think that we have to say to ourselves, it's good if the work that we do impacts all of society and causes these ripples all around. That's great. But it's not like the kind of thing we want to wait around for. We want to get on the road with doing the things that we're going to do. And I think Fitz has talked about this too, which is, what she says is Mr. Global, when their op fails, the total lockdown, pharmaceutical control, the UFO threat is the way I look at it. When they do that part and it fails, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be like Berlin after the war. And so her thing is, what are we going to pick up the pieces with? That's why we can't really wait around just to see if humanity wakes up and fights this thing off. We already have to be engaged in that process. And, that starts even with groups like what we're doing right here and in the ideas room and these types of things. It is the conversation that's going to propel us onward. And that's something to keep in mind as we go forward on this. Okay, I'm going to jump back to our friends deep back in time, early in time, to find out how the UFO files got screwed up and who took control of this. And also there are pieces back there that show very plainly that there was transparency. People were aware. If we can key into some of that awareness before the disinformation sits in, that's something else.
Before you go into that, I was about to ask you, let's just get really clear. When this first started, you think there wasn't control. You think it was asserted at some point.
No question, yeah.
So how soon was it asserted? Roswell?
Almost immediately.
Okay.
Yeah, almost immediately. And I think that the in 1941 with the Cape Girardeau case, if you go into that, I did an episode with Linda Moulton Howe on this, and Paul Blake Smith was the book she was drawing from. And he's done some good work around that. But basically, again, the Masonic secrecy aspect was active. And this is kind of what catapulted Truman, because he now had a role in the UFO file. Because there was a crash in Cape Girardeau. And there are unusual things about Cape Girardeau in history, generally. But the crash that happened there, and the bodies and stuff, there's a very interesting story about these two sisters whose dad was a minister. They sent the minister out to give last rites to what they thought were plane crash victims. And when he got there, he realized that these are aliens, dead aliens. That's 41, 6 years before Roswell. So even the case with Maury Island involves a kind of mystery magic metal, which happens weeks later in Roswell. So there's something going on there with crashes and things. In the case of Maury Island, if we go back into that case, what happens is that there's a guy who's a logger who works on a boat getting these logs that kind of get away from these lumber companies. And his name is Harold Dahl, and he's a big backwoods guy. And his boss is a fast-talking guy with a lot of secretive military OSS connections and everything else, living out there as well, in Fred Crisman. Crisman is so interesting and so important to the UFO story and the deep state story. He's like a parallel track man. But Dahl basically reports to him that these craft went over the boat, and it looked like 6 donuts. And that they were round, and they were kind of like had holes in the middle. And they're just circulating around, and it looks like one of them is having a really hard time, so 2 craft are hovering around it, basically trying to get it back up to normal. And it basically jettisons all of this stuff all over his boat, just sort of like hot metal, slag, as they call it. And it kills his dog, it burns his son's arm, and it causes damage to the boat. So when he goes back to Crisman, somehow Palmer picks up this story that this happened to these 2 guys. That's how Arnold gets involved with it. And then Arnold shows up unawares like, hey, I just had this very interesting sighting of my own, and now I'm going to talk to these guys because I'm getting paid by this Palmer guy. And he goes down there, and all these weird things start to happen to him. I'm going to read, actually, a couple of things from his book, which I find very interesting and often overlooked, and I don't know why, because it's called The Coming of the Saucers. This is an original magazine ad. It's about 10 years after his sighting, and there he is, Arnold, getting into the plane that he saw the craft in initially in the first place. So a couple of odd things happen now. This is the story that Dahl is telling to Arnold about it. He says, on June 21st, 1947, in the afternoon, about 2 o'clock, I was patrolling the east bay of Maury Island, close into the shore. This practically uninhabited island lies directly opposite the city of Tacoma, about 3 miles from the mainland. This day the sea was rather rough, and there were numerous low-hanging clouds. I, as captain, was steering my patrol boat close to the shore of a bay on Maury Island. On board were 2 crewmen, my 15-year-old son, and his dog. As I looked up from the wheel of my boat, I noticed 6 very large donut-shaped aircraft. I would judge that they were about 2,000 feet above the water and almost directly overhead. At first glance, I thought them to be balloons, as they seemed to be stationary. However, upon further observation, 5 of these strange aircraft were circling very slowly around the 6th one, which was stationary in the center of this formation. It appeared to me that the center aircraft was in some kind of trouble, as it was losing altitude fairly rapidly. The other aircraft stayed at a distance of about 200 feet above the center one, as if they were following the center of one down. The center aircraft came to rest almost directly overhead, about 500 feet above the water. All on board our boat were watching these aircraft with a great deal of interest, as they apparently had no motors, propellers, or any visible signs of propulsion. And to the best of our hearing, they made no sound. In describing the aircraft, I would say they were at least 100 feet in diameter. Each had a hole in the center, approximately 25 feet in diameter, and they were all some sort of shell-like gold and silver color. Their surface seemed of metal and appeared to be buried when the light shone on them through the clouds. They were brilliant, not all one brilliance, but many different types of brilliances, something like a Buick dashboard. Now here's what's so interesting. I've never heard of UFOs that had a circle in the middle that you could see through. So he's looking at something that's quite unique. And these are different craft than what Arnold sees, which again have that crescent shape. So these are totally different, even though they're right in the same timeline here, and only separated by a couple of days. So, but it is interesting that if you look at Mount Rainier and Maury Island, they're, you know, you're still in that Pacific Northwest region. And so I would say that there's the fact that people look at this case and say that there's something between these two cases that they have in common, I think it is true. But the craft are very different. And also the fact that this guy's seeing multiple craft, just like Arnold saw multiple craft, is also interesting. So what proceeds from here is that Dahl, the big logging guy with the son, gets his son some medical attention for his burnt arm, and he comes back, and he's visited the next morning by this guy, well-dressed guy in a black suit. And this is the first Men in Black experience. And this guy takes him out and talks to him and says, you know, I want to know more about your business. And Dahl thinks he's a potential customer. And he takes him out to breakfast at this very fancy place, and he's like, look, you can't talk about what happened yesterday. And he details exactly what happened, when they went out, what the temperature was like, all the rest. Again, this level of surveillance, very deep level of surveillance for 1947. And so Dahl is freaked out. And he's like, well, what do you mean? Like, I can't talk about it? What happens then? And then he says, well, you know, what's going to happen is basically your family's going to be in extreme danger. Your wife, your kid, just don't do it. And you have no idea, like, you know, you'll be in trouble. So he does, in fact, start talking. And he gets into this whole thing where he's quoted in a newspaper. So he disobeyed the Men in Black, basically. And what happens is his son disappears. Son disappears and doesn't show up until months later. And when he shows up months later, he's working in a restaurant as a dishwasher in Utah. So this is a 50-year-old kid who's just poof, he's gone. And he has immense problems. His wife gets sick. And Dahl's life just goes down the drain. And
wait, you're skipping over. So the kid has no memory of how he got there, right?
Exactly.
It's like that picture of, is it Nixon's maid or something? His housekeeper?
Yes.
Okay.
That's true. That's a great story as well. But it does seem that in these cases, the Men in Black do possess different types of drugs and that people lose their memory. In the case of Dahl's son, he didn't remember how he got there, how he got the job.
And he didn't remember who he was, right? Yes,
exactly. So he had a different name, and he called his father. He remembered it. He said, I'm here, you know. And then they go and get him, and he's in Utah. So, in general, what that tells us is already in place is the next protected group is already at the floor. But I'll tell you what's which is that in the beginning of the Black General, John Keel did so much research on them. And by the way, it's still the best research better than his work done. What he said was that when he showed different people, they would all say, you know, the Men in Black kind of looked like me, and they were all like short and you know, having certain types of characteristics that seemed to But interestingly enough, one thing they all had in common was that they have this kind of Asian, almost Asian appearance, almost quite Asian. So Keel got tired of hearing about this, and he was like, I'm going to get all of these different groups, Alaskans, Indonesians, Pacific Islanders, and all the rest, and I'm going to lay them out in photos to see what they do. But the last group that he picked in there were these group of languages, and they are these Sami people who have an ancient folk tradition and are known for very mystical qualities. And he said, everyone that got that picture, boom, that's them. And I usually show that picture when I do episodes of Men in Black. But what's interesting when you talk to and read Dahl's testimony, when he's talking about this Man in Black, there's none of it. This guy looks like an American ad detective, right out of the kind of 40s and 50s milieu. And he's very slick, he looks very expensive, he's well tailored, but there's nothing foreign about him at all. So for me, in looking at that, I say that the character of the Men in Black shifted. And later also, the Men in Black seem to have the ability to pop in and out of reality and to do all sorts of mystical things to their victims. That's much more in line with the Assamis, because it's among them. And I have theorized on this program that at a certain point, this ex-protect group enlisted their shutting up of the witnesses, and that's where those really remarkable stories of the Men in Black come from. But I think the regular guys are just exactly what we would think, government guys. Yes.
So Mobsterful has some interesting things to say.
Yeah.
Maury Island was fake. Dahl was RCAF and Chrisman was USAF. They were flying drugs and bioweapons out of Muller Field near Tacoma. Carl Dahl, PC Wikipedia, Canadian spy. Dahl's father-in-law ran Camp X for the OSS.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things about Chrisman that spill over onto Dahl, but the incident itself, what happened was the Men in Black basically forced him, etc., to say the whole thing was a hoax. Later, if you look at Dahl, he's still active 10, 20 years. We don't have the ability to interrogate Dahl right now. So if I say, well, he wasn't an intel guy, and you say he is, it's hard. But certainly, there are unusual connections around the case, for sure. But the idea that on record, the FBI interrogated this guy and canceled the case doesn't mean anything, unfortunately. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is X Series 194, going deep on the Maury Island case. Kenneth Arnold, Jim Garrison, maybe not Jim Garrison, right in the heart of this with Fred Chrisman. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program, and this is the temperature out there.
Great. You want a question?
Yeah.
Red Boy Genius wants to know, who are the Men in Black working for?
Oh, it's a real good question. Mr. Global.
I was thinking the same thing.
There's that corridor that operates between the intelligence agencies and the aerospace companies. And there's somebody who controls that corridor. But the aerospace aspect is overlooked. And the UFO field that we have overlooks it completely. I don't know why. We put on the record so much in relation to the aerospace aspect, dealing with American political life. For example, things like Caesar or his companies. All of these people, Oswald said, I'm going to be working at NASA. All of his connections there at Riley had gone on to work in aerospace. The aerospace connection is the key piece, and it's why Garrison's work was so controversial, and it was the thing he kept coming up against that was like, how does this make any sense? When he was studying the JFK assassination, we have to really kind of look at some of the stuff that Garrison was doing. By the way, that's Chrisman there, who was Dahl's boss. Chrisman also had another name. Of course, he was a deep intelligence operative, and he worked for Boeing and all the rest. But his other name was John Gold. And that's very interesting. Also, he has different spellings of his name all through his life. This is a typical trait and trademark, just like you hear about Harvey B. Oswald and things like that. There is always a variation to show what phase of the legend that they're in. And this has to be kept in mind. Crispin in particular, it has not been unraveled, and it relates all the way up to today, believe it or not, some of the things that are embedded in the software surveillance world. And I'm going to get into that as well. I want to bring in a couple of interesting people here.
I got to throw a question at you.
Yeah.
Okay, so Rat Boy Genius has a follow-up question. Why would esoteric magicians like the Men in Black work for Mr. Global?
Well, I mean, the same reason that Crowley works for the British government, I mean, they pay them very well. And not all esoteric magicians are on the right-hand side of the screen. A lot of them are on the left-hand path of the screen, and they do things out of self-interest. And some of them, are kind of in between. You think of guys like Rasputin or something. He had really incredible abilities, and the Tsars hired him for his magical abilities. But he also had kind of a bad personal reputation. So it depends. But certainly people who are below par on the character scale can pick up pretty good esoteric skills and misuse them. There's tons of cases like that.
There's shamans and there's sorcerers. Very simple.
That's true. But are all sorcerers bad? I forget.
No, but I think it's how I divide them in my own mind.
Witches. There's a lot here, and what's fascinating to me is I've related my own frustration in looking at a lot of this research, and here's one of the things. The people who study the deep state, who understand the government aspects and how they'll use things like assassination, discrediting, surveillance, and things of that nature, that's one group. And they study things like political assassinations of the 60s, and they understand the JFK assassination, all the different assassinations that have happened all the way, Wellstone and all the rest of it, JFK Jr. So that group understands how the government works in that regard. And then UFO people who study that track, they seem to understand things about government censorship, and that they want the files and all that, but they don't seem to understand that the government has a program of disinformation that, so if they get involved with CIA people, they're not going to get anything near the truth. Whereas deep state, if you told a deep state person, hey, the CIA is going to give you JFK stuff, they would be like, oh, they're just going to let themselves off the hook and give you a phony story. They know that. So it's a much savvier and better educated group who study the deep state aspect versus the UFO file researchers, who can be kind of ad hoc and seem open to anything that gets them attention. And unfortunately that's kind of one of those aspects that happens around the UFO side. So, and you get a lot of that, like the whole entertainment, like the Corbell, TTSA circusy stuff. That whole piece has nothing to do with scholarly research. That's just trying to get a buzz. So, and they can even work with cases that are interesting, like Lazar's case can be interesting, for sure. But if you don't approach it on a scholarly fashion and show, on the other hand, this guy's story is interesting, but a lot of the things behind him fall apart. Yeah, so how much of it is true? So you get a kind of a balance going. Instead, they're just cheerleaders for anything that gets them, media attention. That's the worst type of researcher, and we're surrounded by them on the UFO side. The deep state researchers are very quiet, actually, and predominantly like doing the research, and they like having the edge, so their research is much fuller. But unfortunately, they're not interested in UFO phenomena. So over and over again, when I deal with the deep state people, I'm like, this is all very interesting. By the way, I have this whole thing about UFOs, and they're like, well, I really like all of your research and all the things that you do, but I can't deal with the UFO thing. And then if I go to the UFO people and I say, well, the CIA are like, basically in the business of assassination. You sure you want to take disclosure from them? They'll say, oh, you're paranoid, and, you don't understand, So you have a big problem in these fields. Now I'm going to introduce a third problem, which is neither of those fields seem particularly interested in the supernatural aspect around this. And that's pretty big and pretty major. When you're dealing with the Men in Black, understanding the supernatural aspect, the magical aspect, the occult aspect, if you don't get that in relation to the UFO thing in politics, you're missing a pretty big piece of the picture, and you'll never really put it together without it. So you need all three. You need the deep politics, the occult side, and the UFO aspect all to work together. And unfortunately, those groups all work on different sides. So if you say to somebody, well, here's some interesting information for you, and this came from a psychic, I'm going to read it all out to you. And if that person is a deep state professor, they're not really interested in what a psychic had to say about it. So you get into a conundrum where you come up against different people's boundaries around how they like to get information. But I don't think it helps us get any closer to the truth. So we find ourselves then having to adopt a quality where we embrace mentally the psychic side, the deep state political research, and understand the big picture around the UFO file. And we don't have the boundaries in between. We just study it and understand it as a whole, and you get much closer to the truth. In fact, part of the problem is that, when the CIA is out there, they're trying to gobble up the different spaces and control them. So the consciousness studies, you'll find them very interested in that. One of the things that the TTSA was doing, they were buying up and working with Native American group stories about human origins and things of this nature. That's a really big problem because the CIA seems obsessed with the human origin story. So you can see how if we're going to get to the bottom of things, even like Maury Island, you have the mystical aspect involved with the Men in Black appearance. You've got the deep state aspect involved, as I'll reveal here, with Fred Krisman, who is a Boeing deep state operator. And then you have the UFO part of it, I think, is undeniable, and the case, I think, is a very solid one. In fact, one of the things that happens after Arnold gets there is some military intelligence people come down to talk to him about the case and everything that he's found. And he learns from Krisman, after talking to Dahl and Krisman, that they have actual debris that landed on the ship. So they put them in these cartons and they give them to these military intelligence pilots, and off they go. And those guys have no time to hang around. And Arnold makes a real point of this. He's like, they just really wanted to get out of there. They didn't wait at all. And he's like, I wanted to talk to them. I wanted them to stay overnight and all that. They just take off. And the plane goes down and explodes. So the material itself burns up. But it creates this problem. So you have a UFO sighting which gives off this slag and burns the guy's son, destroys the ship, and then he gets involved, he tells some people, Kenneth Arnold comes down, checks it out, then the military intelligence people come in, they get the material, pack it up in cartons, put it on a plane, and then the plane goes down. So now it's a whole different ball game, and Arnold himself is starting to get afraid, and I'm going to pick up this story actually with a couple of other quotes from Arnold. This book gets really fascinating, and I highly recommend it. And again, he wrote this in 1952, and I think it's largely overlooked, although his sighting isn't overlooked. But what he had to say about what happened to him afterwards really is. And a lot of it's mystical. Make no mistake about it. So here's an interesting thing. So these bad things happen, and he has another military intelligence guy with him, and he's like, let's go back to Dahl and see what his opinion on all this is, and let's talk about his story again. And when he gets to Dahl's house, things get very interesting. So he's talking about these military intelligence guy. He says, I remembered we were standing on the curb, and again, this is Kenneth Arnold, the pilot who had the UFO sighting, but I had forgotten to tell them about the anonymous letter Harold Dahl had received after the story became known. The night I had gone to Dahl's secretary home after he handed me the piece of lava-like rock. He had been using it as an ashtray. So this UFO gives off this weird slag, and Dahl is using it as an ashtray. He got up abruptly and started scratching through all the papers in the kitchen. He was looking for a letter. He said this was interesting. When he returned to the bench a few minutes later, he told me he couldn't locate it, but he would give me a brief synopsis of its contents. Dahl said that this anonymous writer told him that flying discs were actually manned by beings such as we, only less dense, so to speak, than we are. Due to the atomic explosions, the radiation now released in the atmosphere had caused those things to become visible to us on Earth. And this is interesting how advanced this is. These flying discs, which were all shapes and sizes, were the vehicles which the gods of this Earth used to protect this Earth from outside dark influences or enemies. Actually, flying discs were, and had been for thousands of years, the protectors of life on Earth. The letter went on further, Dahl said, to say that these beings, which manned the flying discs, were under severe attack by other beings who are enemies of the people and life on this planet. Dahl got this letter in 1947, so the sentiments are quite unusual for that period. The impression I got from what he told me about this letter was that the flying discs were somehow the intelligence called gods by the Indians, and by all those who claim they have appealed for help from them and have received it. I thought of this while saying farewell to Davidson and Brown. I remember I felt happy at the time that I did not mention it to them, since they apparently lost interest in the investigation. So, you know, what's happening is Arnold is telling the story of the things that happened with Dahl, and the military intelligence people are getting more and more tuned out. It's almost like they're not clued into what happened. So later, what happens is he goes to go back to where Dahl was, and he takes the military intelligence people to Dahl's house. It's only 3 days later, after he's originally interviewed Dahl. Dahl gave him this warning and said that he got warned off by the men in black and all the rest, and then the plane goes down. And then he goes to take these military intelligence guys back to Dahl's house, and he finds the entire place is empty. And then they're like, no one's lived here in years. And he's like, what do you mean? I just interviewed the guy here 3 days ago. And he said, no one's lived here. Look. And there were cobwebs everywhere.
Wow.
So obviously, somebody wanted to lock down the story hard at that point and actually even discredit Arnold. Then Arnold is completely disillusioned. The military guys are like, what's going on here? He had a plane crash. We talked to this guy. He's a magic guy. Now what? So Arnold's like, I'm getting out of here myself. Finally. The name of the chapter, I think, is I'm getting the hell out of here. And he goes to take off in his plane, and the plane goes up about 50 feet, and then the engine goes cold. And then somehow he's able to land it because he's such an expert pilot. And he gets out, and he has another engineer who he calls in, and he looks at it, and they had turned off the fuel to the engine. And he said the only person who could have done it was me. So I didn't do it. So they wanted to basically bump him off after his sighting and after his interview with Dahl. That's how sensitive the Maury Island case is. So a lot of people get into, you know, what happened and what were the craft and all the rest of it. But if you study and explore the ramifications after the fact from this kind of honest broker in the middle, Kenneth Arnold, you can see just how heavy this kind of ex protect line is around this case. Very heavy. So what happens is...
Oh, wait, before you go to that, I have a great question.
Yeah.
So James Clements wants to know, DJ, could Men in Black be, quote, time police sent back to protect events in time to avoid paradox chaos?
Well, you can ask Dan Aykroyd. There's a weird story Dan Aykroyd tells a story, totally straight-faced, about having a major. There was a major Hudson Valley sighting in the 90s, and Aykroyd was one of the witnesses. And after that, he had kind of weird things about UFOs. He even did his own UFO special. But he'd done a show for the Sci-Fi Channel, which interviewed all these people on the UFO file. And then, after shooting for 4 weeks, they called him up and said, "That's it." And he was like, "What do you mean?" It's like, "When is the show going on?" They're like, "We're not going to do the show." You know, they shut him down. And he went downstairs at NBC, he said. He was going to host Saturday Night Live, and he had Britney Spears on the phone because she was the musical guest. And he said, and you know, we know he has a sense of humor, and yet he said this totally straight-faced. He said that these men in black were across the street. They were dressed in 1940s clothes. They had a 1940s car, and they were giving him a terrible look, like, "Don't ever mess with this stuff." And he said that he looked around, looked back, and they were gone. So here's an interesting thing about the Men in Black in terms of time, which is it always seems like the cars they show up in are brand new, but they're brand new models of cars from like 1947, 1948. And their clothing and their hats and all the rest of it seem to be from that era, even though they're impeccably new, like they were, you know, kind of straight off the rack. So time-wise, I think there is something interesting to look at there. And a lot of people have stories like Aykroyd, which is why I don't blow it off as just a celebrity having fun. And he's also had some really... he's done a couple of specials around UFOs, so I think he has some good understanding of it in general. That's pretty good. All right, let's see how much we can get in on this tonight. Garrison. There's Jim Garrison. Oh, look, Garrison did something even more amazing with his research into the JFK assassination. And you would say he was doing really well before he encountered the Kennedy assassination. He was the New Orleans DA. He had won twice, been elected twice. He'd been in the Air Force, and he was also in the FBI. So he had an impeccable record. And by the time he encounters the JFK case, he himself has had, you know, this experience of being in New Orleans and being the DA there. He knows all about corruption. The CIA is there, the Secret Service is there, there's massive mob presence there. So he's a very savvy guy around these things. But when the JFK case hits, and then it's over with, it takes him 3 years to digest the facts around that case before he opens the case himself. And what happens is that he speaks to Russell Long, who's the son of Huey Long. He's a senator out there in New Orleans. And Huey Long was assassinated, by the way. He was the governor who was a real kind of man of the people type. And, you know, he was going to challenge FDR and all of that. He gets assassinated at a train station. That's like around 1940 or somewhere. Russell Long is his son. So he's very sensitive to the assassination aspect. And he starts talking to Garrison, and he says, you know, interestingly enough, when they did tests on all that, you know, Oswald wasn't even up there, and they didn't have his fingerprints and all the rest. And he starts opening Garrison's eyes about the whole thing. Garrison's like, oh my God, all of those things that I heard right after the assassination, I thought there was something strange about those. And so it's that 3-year incubation period of that information. What happens is he thinks to himself, right afterwards, the summer before the assassination, Oswald was there in New Orleans, right, his zone. And he said, I'm going to investigate it, but I'm going to do it outside of the public domain so that they don't know, you know, nobody knows what I'm up to. I can really study these guys. And what happens is, from originally thinking, you know, this is just the CIA and oil men doing it, he keeps running into NASA. He keeps running into aerospace. He keeps running into Boeing. And so these aspects bother him to the point where he calls up the editor of Ramparts magazine, who he's been feeding this information to. And this guy's trying to be getting away from him. And because he's like, you know, Garrison's going to get me in trouble with this. And he says, take the call from the mailroom. They don't think to tap the mailroom. And he said, this is poor security, but I'm going to tell you anyway, it's not Texas Oilmen the way they thought. This is the aerospace wing of the military-industrial complex. And here are the people, and here are the companies. And listed General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. These are the files that the Central Intelligence Agency keeps under lock and key because they can't show how they boxed in Garrison's investigation. There was a assistant to the CIA director, who was Richard Helms at the time, who was notorious for his assassination plots around the world. And his assistant said they employed every strategy, they used every strategy that they could to take Garrison down. That meant discrediting witnesses, discrediting him, using the media, and all the rest. And Garrison got through that trial, but when you see him afterwards, they hit him with a bribery charge. They take him to court for this, and of course, he gets through it and all the rest. But basically, the case kind of destroyed his life. So the movie JFK, when it comes out, is a great, achievement because it goes back and looks at his life. But his life was kind of destroyed there. He did get to live long enough and even have a cameo in the movie as Earl Warren, which is hilarious. But I think that when we're looking at Garrison in the 60s, we have to take a real snapshot because what he does is he runs directly into X-Protect through the figure of Guy Bannister, Fred Crisman, these different figures. Bannister was the FBI chief of Chicago who was running Private Eye Network out of New Orleans. He's using Oswald to infiltrate left-wing groups. He's an extreme right-winger. And so the idea of Oswald working for this guy is unusual. But Garrison goes into that. He finds that Oswald had an office in Garrison's at Bannister's place. Now, this is an interesting thing because, of course, the intelligence connections around Oswald are dramatic, and that's a big piece of the Kennedy story, and they always leave that out. They never talk about it because